Hey gals and guys, I'm Hayze, this is Almond Brownies, and welcome back to another sculpt. As usual, this sculpt is going to start with me laying down a nice layer of clay on my head cast. So instead of talking through this rather repetitive process, I'm going to tell you about the motivation behind this sculpt. This is Reaper from Overwatch, and those who know me and what I've done and made and have seen previous videos on the channel know I've made a Reaper mask before. You can see the very first one I ever made and still have in the background, as it was my first sculpted polyurethane resin mask. However, I sculpted that mask just after the announcement at BlizzCon. So that mask's like a year and a half old, and it was up on the internet in a costume 3 weeks after the BlizzCon announcement of Overwatch. So yeah, one of the reasons why I'm doing Reaper again is because this time round I can sculpt a much more accurate version because we have better reference images than we did when it was first announced. I was working from basically what you see in the top left of the screen here, but now we've got the cosplay reference sheets, we've got in-game stuff with more videos with him in. It's fantastic, so I can make it a lot more accurate. Secondly, I've made a lot of these Reaper masks. I've made a fair few of them because they go on my Etsy store. I've given a few away to some friends, and also I've made some in like plaster for live roleplay events where I gave them to villains who were wearing them, and we could take the masks off and smash them because they're made out of plaster and they smashed fantastically. So not only is the silicone mold being used a lot, it's been used very roughly with lots of different materials. So I need a new, better mold for making more Reaper masks, which brings me to the third point. I am better at this now than I was a year and a half ago when I did this. So the sculpt will be better, the mold will be better, it'll just be of higher quality, so I'll be able to produce better quality stuff, which of course is actually really cool because there aren't many times as an artist or as a crafter like this that you get to go back and redo something you've already done and do it using everything you've learned from the last year. It's fantastic, and I am really looking forward to having the first mask from this mold finished and sat next to the old mask you see on screen here. I think that's going to be fantastic to see. Now I'm going to introduce you to a part of the sculpt I don't usually share. This is what I've heard called putting the sculpt to bed. Basically, because we're using water-based clay has a tendency to dry out if you leave it exposed for too long. But we're currently 6 hours into this sculpt, and I need to come back to it 2 days later. So what do? We cover it in cling film. Now, we're just draping the cling film over, so we're not dragging it across the surface of the sculpt and, interrupting anything we're working on, but just putting this sealant of a couple of sheets of cling film over the sculpt and then putting the whole thing under a plastic bag, making sure it's all nicely moistened, and I tend to actually spray around the entrance of the plastic bag just to try and capture a bit more moisture, and that, in theory, means that you can use this for a lot longer. It extends its working time. However, we've been sculpting this for 6 hours. We've got to a point where we have the whole basic shape of the sculpt down, and because it's water-based clay, it is still quite soft because it is all still quite fresh and still quite wet. Leaving it for a couple of days, even with this whole arrangement, it will still dry out a little bit, which is exactly what we want because we want the whole sculpt to be firmer, because what we're coming back to do are all of the details in it. And here we are, 2 days later, carrying on with the sculpt. One of the big things that is happening now, I'm actually going over all of the parts that are uneven and incorrect, because I've taken photos of the sculpt, I've examined them for a couple of days, I've shared them with friends, I've compared them to more reference images, and I know what needs to be adjusted for accuracy. As opposed to after you've been sculpting something for 6 hours, it's really hard to tell where the flaws are, such as I'm raising the extension of the brow around the head to be a bit more accurate, and the ledge just behind the eyes is brought down a bit, and also with the more solid clay we can define the edges of all of the shapes and all the polygons of the mask a lot better, because it's quite hard to put detail into clay, very fine detail into clay, if it's too soft, because you affect too much of it with one tool movement. Whereas if it provides a lot of resistance, you can put a lot of fine details into it, and sharp edges are a fine detail. This isn't like talking about wrinkles or little pucker marks or pores on skin, but it's a similar thought. And now 2 more days later, the sculpt has been put to bed and brought back out again. Now we put the final details in it, which are the marks on the top of the mask. I'll be putting in little leather rivets in place of the actual rivets. Rather than trying to sculpt perfect circles, I use actual leather rivets. And also we put the battle damage in at this point. And I'm kind of doing them in much the same way that I do any kind of scales or any kind of thing that I want to look a bit more natural, because we want to make this mask look a bit more like bone. We're gouging out things, wetting it down, then taking them out and doing that a couple of times until it looks like very naturally supposed to be in there. And we're doing that for all of the battle damage as well. And then I put a bone texture in the whole thing using a wet sponge and a fair bit of water, just going over it, wetting it down, actually letting it dry out a bit and then softening the texture a bit so it's really quite subtle. But the dry brushing process at the very end will make it, bring it out, and then that also allows us to differentiate the smooth texture of the cheek parts because they are metal, of course. And there we have it. What do you think? This is my brand new updated Reaper mask. I'm so happy with this, and I've successfully cast and moulded the first ones, and the first one came out on stream. So if you missed that, don't worry. The video will be up probably next week and you'll get to see a finished version. So thanks for joining me. I hope you learned something. If you like this, don't forget to comment and subscribe to the channel and share this with any other aspiring Reaper cosplayers. And hopefully I'll see you around the channel soon. Bye!